Hello, everybody.
Hey
it,
Carlos, how are you? I'm Klaus.
Hi, Klaus. How are you?
Good.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you well in person, virtually.
Well, in my virtual presence,
Yeah.
not exactly in person.
so we're just gonna talk about what you do and your vision on intermedia and new media and tech art and all that kind of stuff, and talk about your work and the kind of things that you do in your practice and that you're interested in. Because from what I've found, there's quite a wide scope of things that you write about and work on. So if you could start and just tell us about who you are and what you do, that would be great.
Sure, of course. Um, well, I was born in Bogota, Colombia. I understand Klaus is Colombian too.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yep.
Yes, half Colombian, yeah.
And I grew up in Venezuela, so I'm actually Venezuelan, Venezuelan nationality, and now I'm an American. And I thought I'd mention something interesting because I was reading about your program and the interdisciplinary nature of it. And back in 1982, I joined the Intermedia program at the University of Iowa. And what's interesting there is that was the first interdisciplinary program that brought electronic music, the traditional arts, video art, installation art, and science together into a program. And this program was initiated by Hans Brather back in 1968, I believe. And his intermediary lab was the first of its kind in the academic setting, in the collegiate setting.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that would be an interesting feature of my education. So I approached Intermedia and video art from electronic music.
Okay.
I was trained as a composer and a pianist as a very young kid. And what's interesting there is that in this interdisciplinary hub of musicians, artists, scientists, I was able to bring to the table quite a bit of experience in the time-based arts. And when I do say electronic music, I don't mean electroacoustic music. I mean
like completely electronic synthesized kind of.
Yeah, I mean the timbral revolution that started with Henri Schaffer and John Cage.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're really sculpting sound, and it has nothing to do with tonal music.
Yeah.
So having said that, it's interesting that I was able to dive into the visual nature of Intermedia, having a lot of experience in time-based activities, and I think that gave me an advantage over traditional artists that were accustomed to working in a much more rigid time frame, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the artist does have a time frame as it develops, say, a painting, a traditional painting, but once the painting is done, it's pretty much set, and there is no time element. But of course, you could argue otherwise.
Yeah.
And so that's just a little bit about my academic foundations. Um,
How did you get in from music to fine arts? Because it's interesting. That's exactly what I'm doing now as well. I'm a trained musician. I have a degree in music, and now I'm deciding to change and become more into like visual arts, transdisciplinary media arts, intermedia arts. So how did that change come about for you?
well, I was lucky at the University of Iowa. I was studying with Kenneth Cabuto. He's no longer with us, but he was a student of Harry Parch. I don't know if you know who
Yeah.
Harry Parch is, and uh, they were both very unorthodox composers, and they borrowed from many different um, disciplines, including haptic poetry and microtonal music. But anyway, Kenneth Cabuto and Hans Brader joined in partnership. As I say, it was an interdisciplinary program. So I was lucky to be involved in that historic moment there, because I think it was one of the very first programs that united all these areas together.
Mm.
So it was a happy coincidence, but one where I thrived, and I think I thrived again because I had plenty of experience in time-based arts, and I think if I can develop that idea a little more, just to illustrate, as a video artist, which was what I first explored as a visual artist, video art, excuse me. You have to edit and make decisions in a time-based sequence. There are many sequential units that you have to edit, and that's where your artistic aesthetic, as well as of course the material and everything, but the sequential nature. And you're a musician, so you know that to make a phrase, timbral phrase or a melodic phrase or a rhythmic phrase, that you have to be able to suture together a number of events.
Mm.
And so I think I thrived there because I was able to agglutinate or amalgamate material in a time frame. And it's different for, say, a painter to approach video art, or a photographer for that matter, and I mean this in a good way, to approach the time-based arts, because photographers and painters are not necessarily making decisions in time. So again, to answer your question, it was a happy coincidence, and one that I've cultivated over time. And what I find myself is being less of a composer and more of a visual artist as time goes by.
And now when we were talking a little bit on Monday, you were saying that you were filming like performance art pieces as well. Do you engage in performance art piece too in your own work?
Yes, well, as a musician, again, we have a performing aspect to what we do. So once I was a video artist and I had done some installation work, it was a very natural transition to also engage in performance art, which, as we all know, is quite different to the traditional performing arts. For one thing, it has very little to do with method and tradition. And as I tell students and friends, the least theatrical you are, the least actorial, so the least you engage as a traditional actor, the better performer you are, and I mean performance artist you are. So again, digressing a little bit, back in the 80s in that program that I mentioned, one of the great things about that program at the University of Iowa is that they had a international artist workshop. And they brought people like Robert Wilson, Laurie Anderson, Willoughby Sharp, and they brought Raúl Marroquín as well to the program. This was back in the 80s. So I met Raúl in the 80s, and in 2006, Raúl invited me to do a short segment in his TV show, Hookstein. And I mentioned that to you on Monday. I think it's an interesting exercise that I did, and I did this show for 5 years. I had 10 minutes on Raúl's show, and for those 10 minutes, what we did was performance art, basically. And so that's where I really got into it, was doing that exercise for Raúl Marroquín. And the nature of that exercise, I thought, brought some very interesting things, and I may be wrong, but I think I was one of the first to do this. And what I mean was, on the one hand, live performance art traditionally is only recollected through documentation. You have to be at the gallery, you have to be at the space to experience the performance. And the only way of seeing it afterwards is through documentation. And documentation is generally done, with a steady camera or not, but it never really captures the essence of the performance. It's just a documentation, and that's a theme that could be argued too. And my approach to my segment was that rather than documenting the performance, the perspective of the camera was the perspective of the viewer. So rather than having a performance art piece in a gallery or an alternative space, it was done through the lens or through the peephole of a camera. So it was a virtual gallery. And you can see some of the reruns of the 5-year run that I had with him. You can see that the single perspective of a camera, of a peephole into the performance opens up an entirely different dimension. And it's really not a documentation of the piece anymore, but rather the experience itself. So I think that is very interesting on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the fact that it's live on TV also, I think, is a first. Performance art live on TV is not necessarily your strong dish. And for one thing, it's not supposed to be entertaining either. So that's where I really started getting into performance art.
On your article that you wrote about Intermedia, you talk a lot about perspective and how those are like captured in time, little like bings in consciousness. Can you talk a bit more about that? And because it sounds like you use that in the way that you were already exploring that in the way that you were filming these live performances, or these live, performance art pieces.
Yeah, I talk about bings of consciousness and really it's before I mention the bings of consciousness, I talk about snapshots.
Yeah, that's right.
And it has to do with current cognizance and neuroscience, in that the way we perceive the world, apparently we perceive the world in a non-stop sequential form that doesn't stop. It's just ongoing, and in reality, we are freezing, um, let's say, framing reality in 40 hertz per 40 hertz per cycle per second.
Mm.
Some people do it faster, like Buddhist monks can do it in 80 hertz per second. So the mechanics of our perception, the cognitive mechanics of how we perceive, are done by framing reality in these little frames. That's what I call a snapshot. And then we sequence, or we suture. I use the word sutra, but it comes from suturing, but
Like wounds, sewing wounds together.
Sewing the snapshots one after another, and that's what we interpret as reality. It turns out that like when we blink, we all blink many times a minute. And what happens to the world when we blink? Does it disappear? Does our present stop? No. We don't even notice when we blink. Reality keeps going forward. It's like a tape that's running, regardless of whether we blink or not. What happens when we do blink is that our brain fills those moments with frames of our own making. So it's interesting then that what we perceive as a flow of reality is really a construct of small frames, some of which are created by our own doing. So the Bing of consciousness is that snapshot, and this is a phrase that was put forth by a neuroscientist called Stuart Hamroff, and he's out of the University of Arizona, and he works with anesthesia in the operating room. He's a PhD in anesthesiologist. So he's been studying this theme of consciousness for a long time, and he was the first person that kind of coined the idea of bings of consciousness as these snapshots that occur at 40 hertz per second. So in my paper of Intermedia being, I'm kind of explaining how cognizance and conscious awareness happens, and what I'm moving towards in my paper is trying to differentiate conscious awareness from consciousness itself. I think there's problems in the way we describe a conscious perception, and it's really important to differentiate conscious awareness and consciousness, which maybe could also be called proto-consciousness, which exists prior to our conscious awareness. So beings of consciousness has to do more with conscious awareness than it has to do with consciousness.
And then you say that you believe that intermedia art or transitional media art is can really bring that out in a viewer. You were saying more than static art or something like.
Yeah, and I think that is interesting for your program at the Paris College of Art, which I read the mission statement and the experiential arts happens to be a highlight of that program, and I strongly believe that Intermedia is for it to be effective has to be an experiential uh, phenomena. And Dick Higgins, and I mentioned this in my article, mentions as well, and this was back in, I think it's 68. You have to look back on that. He mentions that the intermedia has to be transpersonal and sort of cathartic experience for it to be of any relevance. So I really think that for intermedia and new media to be effective, it really has to change the observer. Not only change him internally, but also engage him to become a participator. I think we could really talk a long time about the transpersonal nature of intermedia. And I don't know if we could do that in another moment. I have to also mention that I have to be at work at 8:30.
What time is it now for you?
It's 10 of 8.
Okay.
So I do have maybe 5 more minutes.
That's okay. That works out. And so then I wanted to also ask you, how did you move on from being an artist to then being quite like a prolific like columnist as well? Like you write a lot of articles about subjects that aren't necessarily art related. Like I was just reading your article about a blueprint for change. How did you move into that kind of a realm? And does that still influence your art, or do you still consider it as like a transdisciplinary kind of way to express yourself?
Both. I've always been interested in a wide range of subjects, and I actually did a pre-med in college, so I have a very strong science background. And I come from the arts, so it's a very happy encounter there. And so I have sort of the theory in the background and the basic understanding of science, because science is a very broad field. And I've also been very interested in the social context of where these ideas flourish, and the historical context attached to many of these ideas. So that's always been with me. What's new about all this is my writing, and that was a very happy coincidence too, because 6 or 7 years ago, I was invited after a dinner to write a column for a magazine out of Amsterdam. And the editor of the magazine thought, after our conversation at dinner, that what I was talking about might be an interesting column for them. So I did. I wrote that, and after that, it's just been nonstop. People have asked me to write. I have a knack for writing. I enjoy writing. And I think it also has to do with my origins as a composer. The fact that we are so good at editing memes and editing material has really facilitated my writing, because I'm able to edit. I'm a very good editor. So I write an idea and then I edit it quite a bit. So I've been lucky and effective. By the way, I'm this Friday. I'll know if I win the Cuellar Awards in Amsterdam.
Yeah, that's the for a forecaster, right? That's the
I've been nominated for a piece. Blueprint for Change is the name of the piece. And I've been published by a number of online journals, and I also was published by PAJ. So I think it's something that I'll keep doing and that I do very well, and I'm very happy to have crossed that that path. So I think my message to you all is that you have to be attentive, because these happy coincidences, as I've mentioned two of them already today, happen, and you don't necessarily know that you're going that way. Just engage and bring them on, if you will.
Cool. Do you still have a small moment, or are you edging out the door?
I should be kind of saying goodbye, and I was hoping we would start at 7, so we could get a little more of this conversation going. And I'd be happy to come back.
All right. Well, we'll organize it with Klaus for sure, because I think there's plenty more that we can talk about.
Quite a bit more we can talk about, not only in the arts and new media, but also in my other writing. And I encourage you all to investigate some of the things that I say. But I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity.
Well, thanks for waking up so early and coming and talking to us. And also providing us with a copy of your Intermedia being as well. That's been really very kind of you.
Of course. And I think I'll end by saying that really one of the main ideas of that paper is to propose the experiential arts as a vehicle to explore consciousness. That's not something science is ready to welcome or admit, but I think as artists we have great contributions in the area of neuroscience and consciousness, and we just need to put that out there and have the walls of science and evidence-based work. They need to open up to this possibility. And I have a lot more to say about that, but I'll just leave it at that.
I'd leave it for another time.
But I want to thank you all, thank you Max, and thank you Klaus.
Klaus has disappeared. He also had other things to do, unfortunately. But thanks heaps for taking the time, and we'll try and organize another time as well.
Let's do it again.
Yeah, it's plenty more.
Good luck to you all, and just follow your bliss and pay attention to happy coincidences.
Happy coincidences.
Thank you
Awesome.
so much.
Au revoir.
Au revoir. Thanks.